The morning Alara Ashcombe spent her last $63 on 64 rabbits nobody wanted, half the town of Red Hollow watched from the feed store porch and laughed. A widow with blistered hands, dead soil, and a farm that hadn't produced a single profitable harvest. And she was buying rabbits. Not seed, not flour, not a new plow blade. Rabbits. The trader who sold them to her couldn't believe his luck. The neighbors couldn't believe her stupidity. And Alara herself stood in that frozen mud lot, looking at the crates stacked in her wagon, wondering if she'd just made the worst decision of her life, or the only honest one she'd had left to make. If you've ever bet everything on something nobody else believed in, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments below and let's see how far this story travels. The land had been her mother's idea of a gift. That was how Alara thought about it sometimes. In the quiet dark of the farmhouse, when the wind pressed hard against the walls, and the single oil lamp threw more shadow than light, that the homestead outside Red Hollow had been meant as something generous. Her mother had described it in letters with the particular optimism of a woman who had never actually stood on the property. 60 acres of open frontier, Alara, clean air, room to grow, a place to start over properly. Her mother had died before Alara could write back to tell her she wasn't sure she believed in starting over. And then her brother Thomas had followed their mother into the ground 11 months later. A riding accident, quick and stupid and final the way only accidents can be. And suddenly, the letters didn't matter anymore. The farm in Red Hollow was the only thing left with her name attached to it. She arrived in the second week of October, when the afternoon still held a thin warmth, but the mornings already bit. The wagon she'd hired in Caldwell cost her more than she'd budgeted for because the driver had taken one look at her and quoted a price that assumed she had no options. She hadn't argued. She was 29 years old, alone in a way that felt structural rather than circumstantial, and she didn't have the energy to spend on arguments she couldn't afford to lose. Red Hollow was smaller than she'd imagined. A main street with a general store, a feed and grain merchant, a blacksmith operation that doubled as a repair shop for wagon wheels and farm implements, a post office that appeared to share its building with a dentist, and a saloon that didn't bother with a sign because everyone already knew what it was. The surrounding farmsteads spread outward from the town the way water spreads from a dropped stone, in rough circles, each claim staked at a distance calculated to feel independent while still allowing the farmers to borrow tools and gossip in equal measure. Her 60 acres sat at the eastern edge of that radius, far enough from the center that the ride-in would cost her an hour each way, close enough that she could occasionally see the smoke from her nearest neighbor's chimney. The farmhouse was standing, which she'd been told to count as a positive. She tried. The roof had two patches that looked recent, and one that looked like it had been recent about 15 years ago. The porch railing had rotted through on the left side. Inside, the previous tenant, she'd been told only that he'd moved on, which in frontier language could mean anything from death to bankruptcy to simple wandering, had left behind a cast-iron stove, a broken ladder-back chair, and a smell that took 2 weeks of open windows and scrubbing to fully shift. The land itself was the real problem. Alara walked the 60 acres on her third morning, before the light got too bright and she could still think clearly. She'd grown up on a working farm in Ohio, had learned early how to read soil the way some people read faces, what was underneath, what it was hiding, what it was capable of. The fields around the farmhouse told her a story she didn't want to hear, gray-brown and compacted, with that particular dusty texture that meant the organic matter had been stripped out over years of careless cropping. The previous farmer had planted the same thing in the same place for too many consecutive seasons and taken everything the earth had to give without putting anything back. There were sections along the creek where the soil looked marginally better, darker and looser, but even there the grass grew thin and the ground cracked in patterns that suggested it had been thirsty for a long time. She'd brought seeds. Winter wheat primarily because it could go in late and still produce before the worst of the cold settled. Turnips and parsnips, which were forgiving in poor conditions. She'd researched the Red Hollow region at the county library before she left, reading whatever she could find about the growing season, the frost dates, the average rainfall. She thought she'd prepared. The first planting went into the ground in mid-October. She worked from first light to last light, which at that latitude in that season meant roughly 10 hours of workable daylight. Her hands, already rough from a lifetime of farm work, cracked at the knuckles and bled. She wrapped them in strips of old cotton and kept going. The wheat came up thin, sparse and yellowing at the tips almost before it had fully emerged. The kind of growth that told a farmer the soil was struggling to support even the most basic biological processes. The root vegetables did slightly better, but not by much. By mid-November, when she tallied her honest assessment of what the fields had produced, the number made her sit down on the porch step and stay there for a while without moving. She had enough food to get through the winter if she was careful. She did not have enough to sell, which meant she had no income, which meant the small amount of cash she'd arrived with, $240, the product of selling nearly everything she'd owned in Ohio, was the only buffer standing between her and a situation she wasn't willing to name directly. The townspeople of Red Hollow had formed their opinions quickly. That was the thing about small frontier settlements. They ran on reputation the way engines ran on coal, and a reputation could be assembled in a week from very little raw material. The woman who'd arrived alone from out east bought the old Hargrove place that everyone knew was played out land, and now appeared to be farming it in isolation without any particular signs of success. That story practically told itself. She heard the comments in the general store, not loud enough to require acknowledgement, but loud enough to make sure she caught them. That eastern woman, Hargrove land, Lord help her, doesn't know what she doesn't know. She knew more than they thought. But knowing and having were different things, and the land wasn't interested in what she knew. It was the second week of November when the trader came through. His name was Obadiah Fitch, and he ran a circuit through the frontier settlements twice a year, spring and fall, hauling whatever could be bought cheap in one place and sold at a margin in another. He was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard trimmed close and the kind of eyes that were always doing arithmetic. He pulled his covered wagon into the lot beside the general store on a Thursday morning, and by afternoon had set up a loose sort of open-air market on the tailgate. Elara had come to town for salt and lamp oil. She was counting coins as she walked into Harmon's general store, doing the arithmetic she'd been doing every day. What she had, what she needed, what she could defer, when she heard the noise from outside. Not the trader's wagon exactly, but what was in it. A sound she recognized, the particular soft vocal complaint of rabbits in close confinement, that half murmur, half thump that meant too many animals in too small a space. She stopped on the boardwalk. Fitch had 4 wooden crates stacked on the tailgate and 2 more on the ground beside the wagon. Each one held between 10 and 12 rabbits, a mixture of breeds she could see, mostly common gray, but a few with the heavier, denser build she associated with the Angora crosses her aunt had kept in Ohio. Fat-bellied, short-eared, with that particular dense coat that didn't look like much until you actually got a handful of it between your fingers. "What are you asking for those?" she said. Fitch looked up from his ledger. He took her in the way traders did, assessing, categorizing, pricing. $1 a head, 64 animals. "Why are you selling them by lot?" "Because I've been hauling them for 3 weeks, and I'm not hauling them another 100 miles, he said. Butcher in Caldwell, who was supposed to take them, fell through. Slaughter buyer in Mill Haven doesn't want them until spring, and I can't feed them that long. Got to move them today or tomorrow. So you'll drop the price." "I might drop the price." She stood there looking at the crates. The rabbits looked back at her with their flat, ancient eyes. She had $63 left. She had no plow animal. She had no functioning income. She had a farm that was slowly dying underneath her and a winter that was going to get much harder before it got any easier. She thought about her aunt's rabbits in Ohio, the way her aunt had pulled that dense, soft fur and spun it into something you wouldn't believe. A fiber so fine and warm, it felt like wearing a held breath. Her aunt had done it as a hobby, more or less, something she called just fiddling. But Elara had watched closely, the way she always watched anything that might be useful someday. "I'll give you 60 for the lot," she said. Fitch blinked. "That's less than $1 a head. You just told me you can't keep them, and the slaughter buyer fell through. You're not getting $64 somewhere else today." He chewed the inside of his cheek. 62. 61, and I take them right now so you can move on. He held out his hand. She drove home with 64 rabbits and 6 crates in the back of the wagon she'd borrowed from her neighbor Hester Calloway, who was a widow herself and had thus far been the only person in Red Hollow to treat Elara with straightforward decency rather than pitying neutrality. When she pulled into the farmyard and Hester came to help unload, Elara had stopped to collect her on the way out of town. The older woman stood looking at the crates for a long moment. Rabbits, Hester said. Angora crosses, mostly. Maybe a quarter purebred Angora. You bought rabbits. I bought 64 of them. Hester was quiet. Then, how much money do you have left? $2. Hester turned and looked at her with an expression that Alara had seen before on the faces of people who cared about her and thought she was making a catastrophic mistake. It was a particular kind of look. Not angry, not contemptuous, just genuinely troubled. Alara, I know. The wheat came up wrong. You said so yourself. I know. $2 won't... I know what $2 won't do, Hester. She said it without sharpness because the woman didn't deserve sharpness. I know what the wheat looks like. I know what the turnips are going to come in at. I know the math better than anyone because I've been living inside it for 8 weeks. She stood up straighter. But I've been watching how everyone farms out here. Same crops, same rotation, same methods. And the soil is dying because of it. My soil is already dead. So I can spend $60 on more seed and get $60 worth of thin yield on dying ground, or I can try something different. Rabbits, Hester said again. But this time it wasn't a challenge. It was more like she was trying to understand. The manure, Alara said. Rabbit manure is some of the best organic material you can put back into soil. It doesn't burn like cow or horse. You can apply it directly. 64 rabbits will produce more amendment in a month than I could haul from town in a season. She paused. And the fiber, Angora fiber. Have you ever touched it? Hester shook her head. Alara opened one of the crates and reached in carefully, bringing out one of the larger animals. A gray-white doe with ears that flopped slightly and a coat so dense it made the animal look twice its actual size. She held it out, and Hester, half against her will, reached out and ran her fingers through the fur. She stopped. Lord, Hester said quietly. The warmest natural fiber there is, Alara said. Warmer than wool, lighter, and these animals can be sheared or plucked every 3 to 4 months without hurting them. She set the doe back down. I'm not saying it's a sure thing. I'm saying it's the only thing I can think of that uses what I actually have. Hester looked at the crates for a long time. Then she said, Well, I suppose we'd better build you something to put them in. The hutches took 4 days. Alara didn't have money for lumber, so she went looking for what was already on the property. The far end of the farm had an old equipment shed that had partially collapsed. The roof caved in on one side under the weight of a winter 3 or 4 years back. The lumber was still good, pine planking, rough but sound, and enough of it to work with if you were willing to pull nails and recut to length. She spent the first full day just salvaging material, pulling boards free and stacking them in the barn while the rabbits stayed in their crates with hay piled around them for warmth. Nolan Breyer appeared on the second day. He was the son of the Breyer family 2 farms east, 16 years old and tall for it, with the particular quality of adolescent boys who haven't quite grown into their hands yet. He'd been watching her salvage operation from the fence line for half a day before he finally said anything. You need help with that? Alara looked up from the board she was levering free. Can you use a saw? Yes, ma'am. Can you use it straight? He hesitated. Mostly. She appreciated the honesty. Come on then. He was better with his hands than he'd let on. Careful, methodical. The kind of boy who'd grown up around actual work rather than just the idea of it. He didn't talk much, which she respected. He helped her frame out the first hutch runs, long rectangular structures raised off the ground on short legs, with wire mesh sides that would allow air circulation and let the droppings fall through to collection boards below. Simple, functional, built to be cleaned easily. By the end of the second day, they had frames for 8 hutches. By the end of the fourth, they had 22. My father says you bought 60 rabbits, Nolan said on the afternoon of the third day, driving nails with the kind of concentration that meant he was actually listening for her response. 64. He says it's a strange use of money. What do you think? He kept hammering, didn't answer immediately, which she was learning was how he approached most things. He considered before he spoke, which was not a quality common in 16-year-olds. I think most of the farms around here are doing the same thing, and most of them are doing middling, he said finally. Seems like there might be room for something different. That's what I think, too. Dad says the soil on the old Hargrove place is done. The soil was mismanaged, she said. That's different from done. He looked at her. Is it? Come look at something. She took him to the section of the east field where she'd already made 2 test applications of rabbit manure from the first few days of collection. A pale, dry pellet that didn't smell like much and broke down quickly into the soil. She dug up a small section to show the difference. The treated earth was visibly darker, looser, still not what it should be, but measurably better than the untreated gray dust beside it. Nolan crouched down and picked up a handful, rubbed it between his fingers. Huh, he said. Give it a full season, she said. Maybe 2. You won't recognize this field. He nodded slowly, and she could see something shift in his expression. Not quite belief yet, but the first movement toward it. That small pivot when a person starts to genuinely wonder rather than simply dismiss. The rabbits settled. That was the thing she hadn't fully expected. How quickly they found their routines, their preferences, their small established territories within the hutch runs. Rabbits were creatures of profound habit. She'd known that, but watching it happen in a group this size was different from the few animals her aunt had kept. They had hierarchies. Territorial disputes that never quite became violent, but were expressed in a complex language of ear positions and body orientation she found herself learning to read. The does and bucks she separated carefully, managing the breeding so she wouldn't be overwhelmed before she was ready. She kept a notebook, her 3rd since arriving, the others full of farming calculations that had mostly come up wrong, and began logging everything. Which animals produced the densest coats? Which had the most docile temperament, important for easy harvesting? Which were the strongest, healthiest, most likely to pass good qualities to offspring? It was, she realized, the first time since arriving in Red Hollow that she'd felt like she was doing something that matched her actual abilities rather than simply enduring the gap between what she'd planned and what had been given to her. The foraging helped with the feed costs. Rabbit digestion was efficient. They could process plant material that other livestock couldn't. And the land around the farm, while useless for conventional cropping, was thick with the kind of tough native grasses and early winter browse that her animals were happy to eat. She cut it by hand and hauled it in bundles, supplementing with whatever grain she could afford in the smallest possible quantities from Harmon's store, bought on a tab she was increasingly anxious about. The tab. She owed Harmon $41 by the middle of November. Feed and supplies against future payment, extended to her in the cautious charity frontier merchants used with newcomers they weren't sure about. $41 she had no clear path to repaying before spring. And behind that, the more serious obligation, the land payment to the county recorder's office, $50 due in March, which had seemed manageable when she'd had $240 and now felt like a mountain. She didn't talk about the debt, because talking about it didn't change the numbers. She worked instead. The first harvest of fiber happened at 6 weeks. 6 weeks was early. The conventional guidance she'd read suggested 8 to 12 weeks for a proper full coat. But one of the larger does had developed a mat in her shoulder that needed to come out, and while Ilara was tending to it, she realized the coat was ready. Dense, not tangled, a clean 4-inch length that pulled away from the skin in the particular way that meant the animal was ready for it. She did the whole animal, carefully, patiently, with a wide-toothed comb in her fingers, working through the coat in sections the way her aunt had shown her. It took 2 hours. The fiber came out in soft drifts, impossibly light, that she pressed together in her palm into something roughly the size of an orange. She weighed it on the kitchen scale, 23 grams, enough if she had more to start. She had 64 animals. Even accounting for the younger ones not yet ready, even accounting for the bucks whose coats were thinner, she was looking at several hundred grams within the next few weeks, possibly more. And she had Hester Calloway's old spinning wheel, borrowed on the condition that Ilara teach her whatever she figured out, and the memory of watching her aunt's hands move over the fiber like they knew exactly what they were doing. Her own hands didn't know yet, but they were learning. The first yarn she spun was uneven, thick in some places, thin in others, with a twist that wasn't quite consistent enough. She unspun it and did it again, and again. On the 4th attempt, she produced something she wasn't ashamed of, a 2-ply yarn of soft silver white that she wound into a small skein and held up to the lamplight. It was beautiful. She was not a woman who said that word easily, but it was the right one. Something about the way the light moved through it, the impossible softness of it, the warmth she could feel even before she worked it into anything. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment with the skein in her hands, and she felt, for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, something that was not quite hope, because she was too practical for hope, but was adjacent to it. The sense that she had found the right thread and was holding it. She started with gloves because gloves were small, and she could complete a pair in a week while also maintaining everything else. She used her own hands as the pattern, fitting them to herself first, and the first pair was clumsy, the fingers uneven, the thumb placement slightly off. She wore them anyway because the temperature had dropped into the 20s and she needed them. The second pair was better. The third she gave to Hester, who put them on and stood very still for a moment with her eyes half closed. "I can feel my hands," Hester said. "What?" "My hands. They ache in the cold, have for years. But wearing these..." She opened and closed her fingers slowly. "I can feel them." Word got around in the way that small-town words always did. Not through announcement, but through the involuntary testimony of someone who couldn't stop talking about a thing. Hester mentioned the gloves to her neighbor Margaret Tilson. Margaret came to look and asked if Alara had any more. She didn't yet, but she was working on it. She had 6 pairs ready by the end of November and sold them for $2 each at Harmon's store, which Harmon allowed on consignment with 30% going to him. He had not been warm about the arrangement, had looked at the gloves the way merchants look at handmade goods that might or might not sell, but they were gone within 4 days, $12, enough to reduce her tab and buy another month's worth of basic supplies. The town's general opinion had not changed. She knew this because Nolan reported it to her with the guileless honesty of a boy who didn't quite understand why he was delivering bad news. His father thought she was wasting her time with what he called pet farming. 2 of the men who farmed the neighboring sections had apparently had a conversation in the feed store about how long it would take before she gave up and sold the property. Someone had started calling her the rabbit woman, and not as a compliment. She worked. The blankets were harder than the gloves. She didn't have a loom, couldn't afford one, so she was working with a frame she'd built herself from scrap lumber, the kind of crude ground loom setup she'd seen in an illustration in a book on primitive textile techniques at the county library. It was inefficient. The dimensions were limited by the size of the frame. The first blanket took 3 weeks of evenings and early mornings, woven from a combination of her Angora fiber and some heavy wool she'd spun from fleece purchased at a fraction of cost from the Tilson farm, where they'd had a surplus from a sheep shearing they couldn't sell. The blended fabric was extraordinary. Warmer than pure wool, lighter, with a softness that made you want to keep your hands in it. She wrapped it around herself the first night and slept better than she had since October. She thought about the winter that was coming. She thought about 64 rabbits multiplying at a rate she was carefully managing. She thought about the soil under her east field, darker every week, responding to the amendment she was folding in whenever the ground wasn't frozen. She thought about the numbers, not the bad numbers for once, but the possible ones. The ones that weren't here yet, but could be, if everything went the way she was working for it to go. Outside the farmhouse, the wind was pushing hard from the northwest, bringing the cold down from wherever cold came from, impartial and unhurried. The lamp burned. The rabbits were quiet in their hutches, warm in the hay she'd packed thick for them. She thought about this morning she'd spent $61 on 64 animals nobody wanted. She thought about how it had felt to stand in that muddy lot and make a decision she couldn't take back, with everyone watching and the math working against her. She thought, I'm still not sure if I was right. She thought, but I'm still here, and so are they. She picked up the knitting needles and started another pair of gloves. The cold came down in early December like a hand pressing flat against the land, slow and deliberate, squeezing the last warmth out of everything it touched. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Alara's property froze in stages. First a thin skin of ice that broke if you stepped on it, then something thicker and more serious. Then by the second week of December, a solid gray-white sheet that looked like it had always been there and had no intention of leaving. She had 41 rabbits producing harvestable fiber now. The younger animals from the first controlled breeding cycle were still growing out, and she was managing the herd carefully, not letting the numbers explode beyond what she could feed and house through the winter which was the mistake a person made if they thought of animals as product rather than responsibility. She had notebooks full of observations, which does produce the densest coats, which bucks had the best fiber quality to pass along, which animals were calm enough to harvest without a struggle, and which ones you had to approach carefully or they'd damage the coat fighting you. The fiber came off in the mornings, usually, when the animals were settled and she'd had time to drink her coffee and be still for a few minutes before starting. She'd gotten faster at it. What had taken her 2 hours with the first doe now took 40 minutes for a practiced animal, 25 if everything went smoothly. She did 4 or 5 animals on good mornings, 2 or 3 on days when other things pressed, and the fiber accumulated in clean cotton bags hung from the kitchen rafters, waiting to be spun. The spinning was still imperfect. She'd accepted that. The yarn had a character to it, slightly uneven, with places where her attention had wandered and the twist had gone a little loose. And she'd decided this was not a flaw so much as a quality, the way a handmade thing carries the evidence of the hands that made it. She was not producing factory goods. She was producing something else. The gloves sold. That was the plain fact of it. Harmon had restocked twice now, and the second time he'd come to her rather than waiting for her to come to him, which was a small shift in the power arrangement between them that she noticed without commenting on. He still took his 30%, but he'd also started displaying them in the front window rather than behind the counter, which told her more than he probably meant it to. "People are asking about blankets," he said one afternoon when she'd come in to drop off a new batch of 6 pairs. He was a square-built man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the careful neutrality of a merchant who had learned to keep his opinions away from his business face. Margaret Tilson asked specifically, said her husband's back has been bad and he can't get warm at night. "I have one ready," Elara said. "The second is halfway done." "What would you price them at?" He considered. $8 for a single. Maybe $12 for a full bed blanket if you can make them that size. $8. She ran the numbers quickly in her head. Materials, labor, the percentage to Harmon. The margin was thin but real. "I'll need a bigger loom," she said, more to herself than to him. "Briar over East has lumber he's been meaning to move." She looked at him. "You talking to people about me?" "I'm a merchant," he said, with a minimal shrug that managed to be both an admission and a deflection. "I talk to everyone about everything." Nolan Briar showed up 2 mornings later with a horse-drawn sled loaded with rough-cut pine boards, a paper from his father that said $20 when she has it, no rush, and the boy's own presence offered as labor for the day. She hadn't asked for any of it. She stood in the farmyard looking at the sled and felt the particular discomfort of someone who has spent a long time not accepting help and doesn't quite know how to start. "Your father decided this on his own?" she said. Nolan climbed down from the sled. "I may have told him about the soil," he said. "The East Field. What you showed me with the amendment." "You told him about that?" "He's a practical man. He doesn't care much about the rabbits, but he cares a lot about soil." He pulled on his work gloves. "Where do you want the lumber?" The bigger loom took 3 days to build in the barn, working alongside Nolan in the mornings before he had to get back to his family's place. It was rough work. She was designing something she'd never built before, scaling up from the small frame by logic and improvisation, making mistakes and taking them apart and trying again. The uprights weren't perfectly square. The beater bar she hung from a rope above the frame sat slightly crooked until Nolan rehung it on the 4th attempt. But when she threaded it up and ran the first test pass of warp thread across the full width, something in her chest settled in a way she hadn't expected. 4 feet wide enough for a real blanket. "It works," Nolan said, watching her hands move across the first few rows. "Don't congratulate me yet," she said. "Ask me again in a week when I've finished the first one." He laughed, a short, genuine sound that she'd come to recognize as the real version of his laugh, different from the polite version he used around adults he didn't know well. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" "Wait until a thing is proven before you'll say it's good." She kept weaving. "That's just sense." "My mother says it sounds exhausting." She glanced up at him. "Your mother talks about me?" He had the grace to look slightly caught. "People talk," he said. "It's a small town." "What do they say?" He was quiet a moment, doing that considering thing he did. "Some of them think you'll fail," he said. Because of the land. Because you're alone. Because... He hesitated. Because I'm a woman, she said flatly. Yes. What do you think? He looked at the loom, at the hutches visible through the barn door, the rabbits moving in their quiet, methodical way, the east field beyond with its slowly darkening soil. I think you're the most organized person I've ever met, he said, and I think organized people fail a lot less than other people think they will. She didn't say anything for a moment, then, go check the water pans on the east hutch row. They'll be freezing over by now. By the third week of December, the blankets had become the thing people talked about. Not celebrated? Not yet. The frontier was too careful for celebration, too accustomed to watching things fail in their second season or their third. But the Tilson blanket had gone to Margaret's husband's bad back, and he had slept through 2 full nights without waking up shivering for the first time since November. And Margaret had mentioned this to 4 separate people in a way that made it clear she considered it important. Alara sold 3 more blankets before Christmas, single bed size, woven on the new loom in a tight diagonal twill she'd worked out through trial and error that made the surface denser and more wind-resistant than a plain weave. $8 each. $24 in 3 weeks, minus Harmon's cut, plus the continuing glove sales. She paid off her tab at Harmon's store. She stood at the counter and counted the money out, and Harmon ran his pen through the number in his ledger, and they both acted like this was a routine transaction, which it was, except that she had to press her lips together for a moment before she said thank you, because she'd been carrying that number around in her chest for 2 months, and the absence of it felt strange and large. You've got a good product, Harmon said. I know, she said, and picked up her receipts and walked out. The real problem was still the land payment, $50 to the county recorder by March 1st. She had, after paying Harmon and buying supplies, $38 and some change. The blanket production was steady, but slow. A full bed-size piece took her a week of early mornings and late nights, and there were only so many hours in a day that weren't already spoken for by the animals and the farm work. She could make the payment if nothing went wrong between now and March, if the rabbit feed costs didn't spike, if she didn't lose animals to illness, if the loom held and her hands held and the winter didn't get so bad she couldn't work in the barn. A lot of ifs. She laid them out in her notebook like columns of numbers and looked at them honestly. Then she heard about Silas Crowder. Moss. She heard it from Hester, the way she heard most things worth knowing. They were sitting in Hester's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. Alara had brought a pot of soup as a reason to visit, which was a habit she'd developed because she found that bringing something made it feel less like she was admitting to loneliness. And Hester mentioned it the way she mentioned uncomfortable things, which was by not quite looking at Alara while she said it. You know who holds the note on your property, Hester said. The county land office. Standard frontier claim. No. Hester set down her coffee cup. The land office sold the note 6 months before you arrived. Hargrove fell behind and they sold the debt. She paused. Silas Crowder bought it. Alara was quiet. I don't know that name. No, you wouldn't. He doesn't come out here much. He operates out of Millhaven, runs a lending operation, buys up distressed notes. Hester was doing the thing where her hands moved slightly even when she wasn't holding anything, a nervous habit. He bought 4 notes in this county in the past 2 years, Alara. He's held them all to term, and when the farmers missed the payment date, even by a few days, he's moved immediately to foreclose. The soup sat in Alara's stomach like something heavier than soup. All 4? All 4. The Denny place is a warehouse for a merchant from Millhaven now. The Prescott homestead is sitting empty. Hester finally looked at her. He's not a patient man, and he's not a forgiving one. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know you didn't know. How much do you know about him? What everyone knows? He's wealthy, he's legal, and he doesn't lose. Hester picked up her coffee cup again, wrapped both hands around it. He'll come around in January to inspect. He always does, when a note is coming due, to assess whether the property is worth keeping or worth selling. He comes to the property? Sends a man, usually. Sometimes comes himself if the amount is significant enough. She hesitated. Your note is $60 total with the accumulated interest. That's significant to him. $60. Alara had 38. She did the arithmetic the way she always did, quickly, without letting herself stop at the bad numbers, forcing her mind to keep moving past them to the other side. 12 weeks until March 1st. 4 or 5 blankets, assuming she could keep the pace. Another steady flow of gloves. The numbers were close, very close. Close enough that any interruption, sick animals, a broken loom, a week of weather so bad she couldn't get to town, would put her on the wrong side of it. "What's he like?" she asked. "When he comes?" Hester thought about it. "Polite," she said. "That's the worst part, very polite. He'll tell you exactly what's going to happen to you in a pleasant voice and then do it." Alara nodded. She picked up her coffee and drank it, and didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she'd met men like that before, and that their politeness was a way of making the person on the receiving end feel like the problem was their own fault. She'd learned not to find it surprising. She'd learned not to let it make her feel small, though it sometimes still did, briefly, before she got her feet back under her. She drove home in the cold and went directly to the barn and stood looking at the loom and the hutch rows and the carefully labeled feed sacks and the notebooks stacked on the workbench. She was thinking about $60 in 12 weeks and the particular kind of man who buys other people's distress and calls it business. Then she picked up the shuttle and went back to work. The thing about caring for animals in winter was that the cold made everything take longer. Water froze, which meant checking pans twice a day instead of once, and hauling hot water from the house in the worst temperatures. Feed consumption went up because the animals needed more calories to stay warm, which meant her costs went up at exactly the moment when she was trying to hold them steady. 2 of the younger rabbits developed snuffles, a respiratory condition she'd read about, not usually fatal but requiring isolation and monitoring. And she spent 3 days moving animals around and disinfecting the affected hutch with vinegar and boiling water, losing sleep over whether the illness would spread. It didn't spread. But the 3 days cost her 2 days of fiber harvest and a full day of weaving time. Nolan came every few days without being asked, checking on things, helping where he could. He had a gift for the physical work of the farm, the hauling, the construction, the kind of tasks that required sustained effort without much decision-making. And he did it without commentary, which she valued. He was also, she was discovering, genuinely curious about the textile side of things. She'd caught him more than once standing at the loom studying the weave structure, and when she explained what she was doing and why, the way the diagonal twill created a tighter surface, the difference in warmth between a loosely spun singles yarn and a tightly twisted 2-ply, he listened with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to understand. "Could you teach someone to do this?" he asked one afternoon, running a finger along the edge of a finished blanket. "The weaving? Yes. The spinning takes longer to learn." "I mean, could you teach more than one person? Like, could other people be making these?" She looked at him. He had the slightly flushed look of someone who'd been thinking about something and had finally gotten to the edge of saying it. "What are you getting at?" "Nothing, just—" He stopped, regrouped. "My mother is inside all winter with not much to do. Margaret Tilson's oldest daughter, too. There are women on these farms who have time in the winter is all." He was being careful now, not quite sure how she'd take it. "I'm not saying you need help. I'm saying there's capacity." Alara looked at the half-finished blanket on the loom, looked at the bags of fiber in the rafters, more than she could process on her own before spring. Thought about the order Harmon had mentioned last week. A merchant in Millhaven who'd heard about the blankets and wanted to know if she could supply in quantity. She told Harmon she'd think about it. "Your mother spins?" she said. "Used to, before her hands got bad. But she says they're better in winter when the air is drier." She thought for a moment. The idea had a shape to it. Rough, not worked out, but a real shape. Not just selling blankets one at a time from Harmon's window. Something bigger. Something that made the scale of what she was growing make sense. "Bring her over Saturday," she said. "We'll see if she's interested." Clara Breyer was a compact woman in her late 40s with a dry sense of humor and the calloused hands of someone who had worked hard most of her life without making a particular fuss about it. She came on Saturday morning with Nolan and with Margaret Tilson, who had apparently invited herself, and the 3 of them stood in Alara's barn looking at the setup with expressions ranging from curious to skeptical to carefully neutral. Alara showed them the fiber first, pulled a fresh harvest from one of the bags and passed it around, watching their faces as they felt it. Margaret made a small, involuntary sound. Clara rubbed it between her palms for a long moment without speaking. I've never felt anything like this, Clara said. Most people haven't, that's the point. Then she showed them the spinning, sat down at the wheel, and worked through a sequence, explaining what she was doing and why, letting them see the fiber transform under her hands. Margaret had never spun anything. Clara had spun wool for years and adapted quickly to the different qualities of Angora fiber, her hands remembering the muscle memory even as her mind adjusted to the new material. By the end of the morning, they had worked out a rough arrangement. Clara and Margaret would come 3 mornings a week to spin. Alara would supply the fiber and pay them a small wage against the finished yarn weight. Nothing generous, she didn't have generous, but fair by any measure she could make. She would do the weaving herself for now, on the big loom. The gloves could be knitted in the evenings, at home, when hands were free. "You're building a workshop," Nolan said quietly, when the women had gone and he was helping her bank the barn stove for the night. "I'm building enough to survive till March," she said. He looked at her. "You know that's not all you're doing." She didn't answer him, which was, in its way, an answer. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northwest again, and through the barn door she could see the sky doing the heavy gray thing it did before a serious snowfall. That flattened, pressurized look, the clouds low and close. The rabbits were tucked into their hay, warm and settled. The loom stood in the middle of the barn with half a blanket on it, the warp threads taut in the cold air. The winter wasn't close to finished. The worst of it was still ahead, and she knew it, and that knowledge sat in her chest quiet and heavy, the way knowledge tends to sit when there's nothing to do about it except keep working. She banked the stove and walked back to the house with her hands in the pockets of her coat. The pockets lined with scraps of Angora fiber she'd started carrying without quite deciding to. The warmth of it constant and impossible against her fingers. $38, 12 weeks, 60 rabbits growing their winter coats in the barn behind her. She did not let herself imagine how it would feel to lose the farm. She let herself imagine, briefly and carefully, how it would feel to keep it. Then she went inside and started another pair of gloves. The snow came on the 14th of January without much warning. There had been signs, the way there are always signs when you live close enough to the land to read it. The particular silence that settles before serious weather. The way the animals grow restless and eat more than usual. The smell in the air that isn't quite anything you can name, but that the body recognizes before the mind catches up. Alara had noticed all of it. She'd spent the 2 days prior hauling extra hay into the barn, banking the hutch walls with straw bales, filling every container she owned with water before the pipes could freeze solid. She'd done what she could do. What she hadn't anticipated was how fast it would come, or how long it would stay. By mid-morning on the 14th, the visibility from the farmhouse windows had dropped to nothing. Not reduced? Nothing. A solid white wall that moved and shifted but refused to show her anything beyond the shape of the barn 20 feet away. The temperature dropped through the afternoon in a way that felt personal, deliberate, like the cold had made a decision about this particular piece of ground. By nightfall, the thermometer on the porch post read 12 degrees below zero and was still falling. She slept in the barn that first night with the animals. Not because she planned to. She'd gone out at midnight to check the water pans and found 3 of them frozen solid despite the banked stove, and by the time she'd hauled hot water from the house and rethawed them and checked every animal in every hutch row, the storm had intensified to the point where the walk back to the house felt genuinely dangerous. She made a bed from horse blankets in the corner farthest from the door and lay down with her coat on and listened to the wind try to find the places she hadn't sealed well enough. The rabbits were quiet. That surprised her. She'd expected them to be agitated in the storm, but they'd tucked themselves together in their hay and gone still in the way animals go still when the world outside their immediate shelter has become irrelevant. She found it oddly comforting. She lay there in the dark, listening to them breathe and watching the stove's glow pulse faintly through the grate. And she thought about the land payment and Silas Crowder and the 6 weeks she had left. And then she made herself stop thinking about those things because there was nothing to be done about them at midnight in a blizzard, and she needed to sleep. She slept badly, but she slept. The storm ran for 4 days. In that time, Red Hollow essentially ceased to function. The main road into town drifted over to the point where wagons couldn't pass. Families stayed inside, burning through their wood reserves, feeding their livestock from whatever stores they'd laid in before the weather hit. The Harmon store went dark. The smithy went dark. Even the saloon, which had weathered every previous winter by the simple expedient of never fully closing, shut its door on the second day when the owner couldn't get the chimney to draw properly and the temperature inside dropped below 40. On the third day, Alara got a visitor. She heard the knock on the barn door through the storm noise, barely, a flat sound against the wind. And when she opened it, she found Nolan standing in the gap with ice in his eyebrows and a look on his face that she'd learned meant something had gone wrong at home. She pulled him inside. "What happened?" "The Henderson family," he said, not bothering with a greeting because the situation didn't call for one. "Down the South Fork Road. Their youngest, she's 4 years old. She got cold last night, bad cold, her hands and feet. My mother heard from Mrs. Henderson's sister." He was catching his breath, the cold coming off him in waves. "My mother is trying to get our heaviest blankets over there, but they're not the same as yours, Alara. Mrs. Henderson's sister said the girl is shaking and won't stop." Alara was already moving. She went to the stack of finished blankets at the back of the barn. She had 4 full bed blankets completed and 3 single blankets, plus the one currently on the loom, and pulled 2 of the full bed ones free. She wrapped them in oilcloth against the snow, as much protection as she could manage quickly. "How far is the Henderson place?" 3/4 of a mile south. I came the long way around the drift." "Take these now. Can you make it back?" "Yes. Take both of them. Give them both to the girl first, then the parents." She pressed the bundle into his arms. "If anyone else on that road is in trouble, send them here." He was gone back into the white. She stood at the barn door for a moment after it closed, 4 years old and shaking. She thought about small hands, about the way cold worked on small bodies faster than large ones. She thought about the gloves she had finished, 12 pairs stacked on the workbench waiting for Harmon to reopen, and she made a decision that her accounting mind registered as a loss, and the rest of her didn't hesitate about for a second. She packed all 12 pairs of gloves into a bag. She put on every layer she owned, tied a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed, and she went out into the storm. She didn't make it as far as she'd intended. The South Fork Road was impassable beyond the first half-mile. The drift there was chest-high and hard-packed, the kind that doesn't give when you push into it but just holds you and then presses back. She turned east instead, toward the cluster of 3 farms she knew sat within reasonable distance of each other, and spent the next 2 hours moving from one to the next. The Calloway place first. Hester met her at the door with the particular expression of a woman who is very relieved to see someone and very annoyed about being relieved, which was Hester's version of emotional display. She took a pair of gloves for herself and 2 pairs for her farmhand and his wife, who were wintering in the work cabin. The Tilson place was dark from the outside, but answered her knock. Margaret, with all 4 of her children, gathered in the single warmest room, running one fire between them. She took 3 pairs of gloves without argument. The third farm, the Porters, had a problem that gloves couldn't fix. Old Walt Porter answered the door in a coat he was clearly wearing indoors, and she could see his breath inside the house. The chimney flue had stuck. Ice in the exterior cap, he explained, couldn't shift it. And without the fire drawing properly, the heat he was generating was barely enough to keep the kitchen above freezing. His wife Edna was sitting in a chair by the stove, wrapped in everything they owned, and she was still shivering. Alara looked at Edna Porter. Edna Porter was 72 years old and had the gray color in her face that happened when a body was working too hard just to maintain its temperature. "Do you have a ladder?" Alara asked Walt. "What?" "For the chimney cap. Do you have a ladder I can reach the roof line with?" He blinked at her. "You can't go up on a roof in a blizzard. I'm not going to stand up on it. I just need to reach the cap." She was already looking around the kitchen for something long and thin. "Is there a poker? An iron rod?" 20 minutes later, she was standing on the top rung of Walt's ladder, with her back to the wind and a long-handled chimney poker, chipping ice away from the exterior cap by feel more than sight. The wind kept trying to take her off the ladder. She hooked her arm through the top rung and worked with one hand, which was slower and took longer, and twice she nearly dropped the poker into the snow below. But the cap came free. She heard the sudden change in the draw, that low resonant note when a flue opens up properly. And when she climbed back down and went inside, the fire was beginning to pull properly and the temperature in the kitchen was already responding. Edna Porter looked at her from the chair. "You could have fallen," she said. "I didn't." Alara said. She was unwrapping the scarf from her face, fingers clumsy with cold. I'm going to leave you 2 pairs of gloves. Keep her hands warm especially. Walt was standing behind his wife's chair with his hand on her shoulder. He was looking at Alara with an expression she didn't quite know how to read. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. We laughed, he said. It came out quiet and flat, like he was making an accounting. At the feed store, when you bought those rabbits, I was one of the ones who laughed. Alara looked at him. I know, she said. He didn't say anything else. She didn't need him to.
Yeah.
She got back to her farm in the late afternoon, moving through a storm that had not eased at all, following the fence lines by touch because she couldn't see them. The cold had gotten inside her coat somewhere in the last hour and was working at her core temperature in a way that she recognized as something to take seriously. She went straight to the barn, fed the animals, checked the water, added wood to the stove, and then went inside the house and peeled off her outer layers and stood in front of the kitchen stove for a long time without moving. Her hands thawed badly. That was the word for it. Not painfully, though it was that too, but badly, in the way things that have been compressed come back to themselves too fast. She ran them under cool water, not warm, the way she'd learned you were supposed to do, and waited. While she was waiting, someone knocked on the farmhouse door. It was Clara Breyer, which surprised her. Clara lived half a mile away and had no reason to be out in this. But Clara had made the walk anyway, and she came inside with snow on her coat and a look of someone who had made a decision and committed to it. She was carrying a covered pot. I made soup, Clara said, as if this explained everything. She set the pot on the stove. Nolan told me what you did today. The Henderson girl's going to be all right, by the way. The blankets helped. Alara sat down at the kitchen table. The warmth was coming back into her hands now, which meant they hurt considerably. Good, she said. Clara ladled soup into a bowl without being asked and set it in front of her. She sat down across the table and looked at her with an expression that was direct without being unkind. How much do you still need for the payment? Alara looked up. That's not... How much? She'd been doing the numbers so often they were automatic. $22, maybe $20 if the blanket orders come through before March. Clara nodded. I talked to Margaret before the storm hit, and to Hester. We think, with what we've already got on the wheel, and what we can finish in the next 3 weeks, you'll have at least 5, maybe 6 more blankets, at $8 apiece, sold through Harmon. Harmon's cut. We'll sell through Harmon for the ones that go to town. The ones the merchant from Millhaven wants, that was $12 each, you said. If you can fill even 2 of that order before March. Clara stopped. You can make the payment, Alara, if nothing else goes wrong. Alara was quiet. The soup was hot and tasted like someone had put actual thought into it. She ate several spoonsful before she said anything. Something else is going to go wrong, she said. It usually does. Probably, Clara agreed. But you've handled everything else. I haven't handled Crowder yet. Clara's expression shifted in a way that told Alara this was part of why she'd come. He sent a letter, she said, to Harmon because he doesn't have your address registered anywhere. Harmon got it before the storm. He told me to tell you. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded envelope. He's coming on the 1st of February, 4 weeks from now, to inspect the property and assess the value of the claim. Alara took the envelope but didn't open it. She turned it over in her hands. 4 weeks before the payment is due. Yes. So he wants to see how much the property is worth before he decides whether to take it. That's how he operates, from what anyone knows of him. She set the envelope on the table and looked at it. 4 weeks. She thought about the barn and the hutch rows and the loom and the carefully amended soil in the east field, still frozen under 2 feet of snow, but changed, genuinely changed, darker and richer than it had been in October. She thought about what any of that looked like to a man who dealt in distressed property values and payment deadlines. What does he look like? She asked. She wasn't sure why she asked it, except that she'd been building a picture of him in her mind for weeks, and she wanted to know if the picture was accurate, Clara thought. I've only seen him once at the Millhaven courthouse when the Denny place was finalized. Medium height, well-dressed for a frontier town. Younger than you'd expect, maybe 40. 45. She paused. He smiled the whole time. That's what I remember. Even when the Denny family was standing right there, he smiled. Elara nodded. She finished the soup. Outside, the storm was still running its long, hard argument against the walls of the house, and the lamp on the table threw their shadows up the wall behind them, doubled and wavering. Thank you for the soup, she said. Thank you for the gloves, Clara said, and for fixing the porter chimney. She stood up, beginning to rewrap for the walk home. My son thinks very highly of you, in case you didn't know. I know, he's a good kid. He's not entirely a kid anymore. She said it neutrally, not quite looking at Elara, pulling her scarf up. Elara looked at the table. He's 16. He'll be 17 in March. Clara. I'm not suggesting anything, Clara said, with the particular tone of a woman who is absolutely suggesting something. I'm just observing that time moves. She buttoned her coat. Don't stay up too late. You need to sleep. After she left, Elara sat at the table for another few minutes. She opened the envelope. Crowder's letter was brief, written in a clean, careful hand that matched what she'd imagined. Controlled, precise, nothing wasted. He would arrive February 1st to conduct a standard assessment of the property condition and discuss the status of the outstanding note. He looked forward to meeting her and hoped to find the Ashcombe homestead in satisfactory condition. I look forward to meeting her. She folded the letter and set it aside. The storm broke on the 17th, 4 days of it, and when it finally moved east and the sky came back, that hard, high blue that follows serious winter weather, almost violent in its clarity, the landscape that appeared was something different from what had been there before. The snow was deep and settled, 3 feet in the flat places, and considerably more where it had drifted against walls and fences. The cold remained, sharp and dry, but the wind had died, and in the stillness you could hear things again. Birds. The creek somewhere beneath its ice. The sound your own breathing made when you stepped outside. Elara dug out the barn first, then the path to the house, then the main gate. It took most of that first clear day and left her with arms that ached to the shoulder. But as she worked, people came. Not a delegation, nothing organized, just people making their way out from their own digging out to check on neighbors, the way frontier people did after serious weather, the network of mutual dependence becoming visible again after days of isolation. The Bryars came first. Nolan and his father Joel, who was a quiet man she'd barely exchanged 10 words with before now. Joel Bryer looked at the hutch rows and the amended soil test section she'd uncovered near the barn wall and spent a long time looking at it without saying much. Then he said, "That east field, you willing to show me what you did?" "After we finish the path," she said. He nodded and picked up a shovel. Margaret Tilson came in the afternoon with her oldest daughter, both of them carrying finished yarn. They'd been spinning through the 4 storm days at home, working with fiber Elara had given them before the weather hit. A full bag of soft, gray-white 2-ply that Elara weighed and recorded in her notebook, and felt for a moment the quality of not being alone in a thing. Walt Porter came the following morning on his own, without his wife. He stood at the barn door for a moment before coming in, turning his hat in his hands, the way men do when they're working up to something. "I want to help," he said. "I don't know what I can do. I'm not a textile man." He paused. "But I know lumber. I know construction. If you need more hutch space in the spring, more loom frames, a bigger workspace, I can build it." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "I'm going to need a second loom by April," she said, "if we can get through March. Tell me what it looks like and I'll have it ready." He left, and she stood in the barn alone for a few minutes after he was gone. The storm had done something to people, she thought. Not transformed them, nothing as neat as that, because people didn't transform cleanly. But it had shifted something in the arrangement. The warmth her blankets and gloves had provided in those 4 days had been specific and real in a way that settled arguments that words couldn't. It was harder to laugh at the rabbit woman when her blankets had kept your child from going blue with cold, but none of that solved Silas Crowder. He arrived on February 1st exactly as his letter had said, which she'd expected. A man who ran his business on precise enforcement of dates would not himself be late. She heard the wagon from inside the house and looked out the window and saw a black-painted two-horse rig pulling through the gate with a deliberateness that said it had every right to be there. Crowder stepped down from the wagon himself. Clara had been right about the description. Medium height, well-dressed in a dark wool coat that was finer than anything worn in Red Hollow. The smile was already in place when he turned toward the house. 42, she estimated. The smile had the quality of something he'd practiced until it looked natural, but wasn't quite. He had a young man with him, late 20s, carrying a leather case of the kind that held documents. Crowder himself carried nothing. That told her something about how he thought of his own position. She opened the door before he knocked. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Silas Crowder. Thank you for receiving me." "Come in," she said. She did not smile back because she'd decided not to waste energy on a performance he would see through anyway. "There's coffee." He came in and took the coffee and sat at the kitchen table without being invited to sit, which was a small claim of ownership she noticed and filed. His assistant sat slightly behind him and opened the leather case and produced a sheaf of documents. "The property is in reasonable condition," Crowder said. He'd looked around quickly as he came through. She'd seen his eyes do the quick professional assessment, taking in the neatness of the kitchen, the organized shelves, the lack of any obvious despair. She wasn't sure if that helped her or not. "You've done work here?" "Yes." "The note outstanding as of March 1st is $60. I assume you've been tracking that figure." "I have." "And your current position?" She was quiet a moment. She'd decided on honesty because she thought he'd see through anything else, and she didn't want to give him the advantage of catching her in a misrepresentation. $43, she said. "I'll have more from blanket orders before the 1st. I expect to be at 52, possibly 55 by month's end." He absorbed this with the smile unchanged. "That would leave you short." "Yes, it would leave me $5 to $8 short. The terms of the note don't allow for partial payment, Miss Ashcombe. I think you know that." "I know what the terms say." "Then you understand my position." She looked at him steadily. "I understand your position," she said. "I want you to understand mine." She stood up and put on her coat. "Come out to the barn." He looked slightly surprised. Not much, but enough that she caught it. "Miss Ashcombe, the financial situation is—" "I heard you. Come out to the barn." She showed him everything. The hutch rose, 69 animals now after the winter breeding cycle, their coats thick and dense in the cold air. The loom with the nearly finished blanket on it. The Millhaven merchant's order, $12, due to be collected next week. The bags of fiber in the rafters. The notebook of orders and production records she'd kept since October, which she opened and placed in his hands without ceremony. 14 blankets produced and sold since November, she said. 31 pairs of gloves, 8 pending blanket orders, 4 of them at $12 through the Millhaven merchant. Projected income for February and March, assuming no interruption, is between $60 and $70. She paused. "The Eastfield. Come look at the Eastfield." He followed her, his assistant trailing behind with the document case, looking slightly uncertain about why it had come along. She showed Crowder the test sections, the untreated gray dust soil beside the amended sections, darker and looser even in February, the difference visible to anyone who looked at it honestly. "By spring planting, this field will produce," she said. "Not at full capacity yet. That'll take 2 seasons. But enough to add crop income to the textile income. Next year I won't be $5 short. Next year I won't be anywhere close to short." Crowder was looking at the soil. The smile had changed slightly. Not gone, but slightly more genuine, which was more unsettling than the performed version. He was a man who recognized value when it was put in front of him. She could see him doing arithmetic. "The note terms are fixed," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive the debt," she said. "I'm asking you to extend it 30 days. 1 month. By April 1st, I will have the full $60 and I will pay it in full." She held his gaze. "You could foreclose, you could take the property, but what you'd be taking is a working operation. Rabbits, a loom, 8 outstanding orders, a field that's recovering. You'd have to liquidate all of it, and you'd get less than the debt is worth, because a frontier court isn't going to give you market value on a textile operation nobody out here knows how to appraise." She stopped. "Or you give me 30 days and you get $60 in full." He looked at her for a long time. His assistant had drifted over to look at the hutch rows with what appeared to be genuine curiosity despite himself. 63, Crowder said. $60 and 3 months of accumulated interest at the rate specified in the note. She did the math. 61.50, she said. The interest rate in the note is 5% annually. 3 months is 1.25% of 60, which is 75 cents. The total is $60.75, not 63. He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time, the smile that appeared was something she almost believed. $60.75, he said. April 1st. April 1st, she said. He looked around the barn one more time. The loom, the fiber bags, the rabbits moving quietly in their hutches. His expression was not warm exactly, but it was something adjacent to respect, which she would take. You should have had the full amount by March 1st, he said. Yes, she said. I should have. He nodded once, and that was the whole of it. He gathered his assistant and his document case and walked back through the snow to his black wagon, and she stood in the barn doorway and watched him go, and the cold pressed against her face, and she became aware that her hands were shaking slightly. Not from the cold, or not only from the cold. $60.75, April 1st. 30 more days. She had bought herself 30 days with an argument and a notebook and an east field that wasn't fixed yet but was getting there. She went back inside and picked up the shuttle. The 30 days Crowder had given her were not quiet days. She had expected, not relief exactly, but a slight loosening of the pressure, the way you feel after negotiating a hard thing and coming out the other side with something to show for it. What she got instead was the particular quality of borrowed time, which is that it runs faster than regular time and carries more weight per hour. She was aware every morning when she woke that she was one day closer to April 1st, and the arithmetic she ran in her head before her feet hit the floor had become a kind of reflex, automatic and relentless. What she had, what she'd promised, what the margin looked like. The margin looked survivable. That was the most honest word for it. Not comfortable. Not safe. Survivable, if everything she'd set in motion kept moving the right direction and nothing unexpected came apart. She finished the Millhaven merchant's order on February 6th. 4 blankets at $12 each, $48 that she'd been holding her breath over since December. The merchant's man came on the 9th to collect them, a compact fellow named Briggs, who drove up from Millhaven in a light wagon and stood in the barn looking at the finished blankets with the expression of a person whose expectations are being exceeded in a way he hadn't prepared for. He ran the fabric through his hands the way all of them did when they first felt it, that involuntary pause, that slight stillness. His order for next season, Briggs said, and produced a folded paper from his coat. Alara opened it, read it again. This says 20 blankets. 20 blankets and 30 pairs of gloves, by October. She looked up at him. That's more than I've produced in 4 months. Yes, Briggs said. He's aware of that. He says you can set the price within reason, and he'll discuss a partial advance if that helps with materials. He paused. He sold the 4 winter ones in 3 days, Miss Ashcombe. In Millhaven, which is not a small town. 3 days. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She didn't let herself react visibly, partly because she'd learned not to count anything until it was in hand, and partly because Briggs was watching her in a way that would feed into whatever he reported back to his employer about her composure and reliability. But something in her chest had shifted, a weight redistributing, finding a different balance. After he left, she sat on the workbench for a moment with her hands on her knees, and she let herself feel it. Not celebration. Something quieter than that. The particular sensation of a thing that had been theoretical becoming real. The moment when you stop believing in a possibility and start knowing it. 20 blankets. 30 pairs of gloves. By October. She was going to need more hands. The meeting at Hester Calloway's house happened on the 15th of February, which was not a date anyone had chosen for any symbolic reason, but which Alara would later think of as the point when the shape of things changed from something she was doing alone to something that had become, however informally and imperfectly, shared. Hester had suggested her kitchen because it was the largest gathering space any of them could access without going to the saloon or the church, both of which felt wrong for different reasons. She'd made coffee and set out the remains of a dried apple cake. And when Alara arrived, she found Clara Breyer and Margaret Tilson already there, along with Margaret's oldest daughter Ruth and Walt Porter and Joel Breyer, and, slightly to her surprise, two women she knew by sight but barely by name, Agnes Holt, who farmed with her husband 3 miles northwest, and a younger woman named Darcy Sims, whose husband worked the blacksmith operation in town. She stood at the head of Hester's kitchen table with the Millhaven order in her hand and read the numbers aloud without preamble because these were practical people and preamble would have annoyed them. When she finished, no one said anything for a moment. Then Joel Breyer, who had spoken maybe 40 words in Alara's presence since November, said, "That's real money." "Yes," she said. "For how long?" He mentioned quarterly orders if the first one is filled properly. He's supplying hotels in 2 cities and a general merchant in a third. There's apparently demand for quality winter goods that aren't being filled by current suppliers. She put the paper down. "I can't fill this order alone. I can't spin and weave at the pace this requires and also manage the herd and the farm. I need people who can spin consistently. I need another loom, maybe 2. She looked at Walt Porter. "You offered to build." Walt nodded. "I'll have a second loom ready in 3 weeks. Third one by end of March, if you need it." "I need it." He nodded again. "Pay structure," Clara said. It wasn't a question. She was naming the subject that needed to be addressed and had chosen the directest path to it, which was the thing Alara had come to appreciate most about Clara Breyer. "Per weight of finished yarn, same as we've been doing," Alara said, "plus a share of the blanket revenue for the weavers. I've written it out." She produced a second paper, not the merchant's order, but her own calculations, the breakdown of what she could pay and still keep the operation solvent. She passed it to Clara, who looked at it, and passed it to Margaret, who passed it around the table. The number was not large. She wanted to be clear about that before anyone had time to build a different expectation. "It's not large," she said. "Not yet. What it is honest, and it will grow if the orders grow." She paused. "If anyone thinks the number isn't worth their time, I understand that completely. I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking for work, and I'll pay for work." Ruth Tilson, who was 19 and had been quiet through the whole thing, looked up from the paper. "Can I learn the weaving? Not just spinning?" "Yes. It takes a few weeks to get consistent, but you'll get there." "I want to learn the weaving," Ruth said, with a certainty that closed the subject. Agnes Holt said, "My husband will want to know what this does to my time on our farm." "I can only answer that for myself," Alara said. "The arrangement I'm proposing is flexible. Mornings at my place 3 or 4 days a week, depending on the season. The rest of the time is yours." Agnes considered this. She was a heavy-set woman with a direct gaze that Alara respected. "I'll try it for a month," she said. "If it works with what we've got going, I'll stay." "That's fair." Darcy Sims hadn't spoken yet. She was the youngest in the room, maybe 24, with the slightly watchful quality of a woman who doesn't speak until she's sure she has something worth saying. "What happens if Crowder doesn't accept the payment on April 1st, she said. "Even with everything?" The room went quiet. Alara had expected this question and had decided to answer it honestly rather than reassuringly. "Then I lose the farm," she said, "and everything in it reverts to him as collateral, and everyone who's invested time and materials in this—" She stopped. "Which is why I'm going to make that payment. But you deserve to know the risk before you commit your time to it." Darcy looked at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "I can spin. My grandmother taught me. I'm better at it than she was." Something in the room shifted then, not dramatically, because these were not dramatic people, but the quality of the gathering changed from a meeting about a proposal to something that had already been decided, everyone just finishing the formality of it. Hester poured more coffee. Joel Breyer started asking Walt Porter about loom dimensions. Clara moved over to sit next to Alara and said quietly, "You all right?" "Yes," Alara said. She meant it, mostly. "You look like someone just handed you a weight you weren't expecting." "I'm not used to people deciding to help," she said. "Not this many at once." Clara looked at her steadily. "You spent 4 days in a blizzard handing out gloves and climbing ladders in a snowstorm," she said. "People remember that sort of thing." February became a kind of organized intensity that Alara hadn't experienced since the early weeks of farming in Ohio, when there was always more to do than could be done, and you learned to triage by necessity. The barn in the mornings was full of people and noise in a way that startled her the first few days. She'd spent 4 months in a quiet that had become so normal she'd stopped noticing it, and now there were 5 women working the spinning wheels in a row along the south wall, the wheels making their particular dry, rhythmic sound, and conversation moving between them in the natural way of people doing repetitive work together. She hadn't expected to like it as much as she did. Ruth Tilson turned out to have a gift for weaving, the kind of spatial intuition for pattern and structure that couldn't be taught, only recognized once it appeared. Alara had spent 2 mornings walking her through the basics of the floor loom Walt had completed, and by the 3rd morning, Ruth was running it herself with a focus that excluded everything else in the room. Her first full piece was uneven in places, but the basic structure was sound, and her second was better, and by her 4th she was producing work Alara would have signed her own name to without hesitation. "You're going to be better at this than I am," Alara told her one afternoon, watching Ruth work through a complex twill pattern she'd figured out from examining one of Alara's finished blankets. Ruth didn't look up from the loom. "I know," she said, without arrogance, just as fact. "But you thought of it first. That counts more." The soil amendment work continued in the East Field during the breaks between textile sessions. Alara and Nolan, primarily, hauling and folding the rabbit manure into the thawing ground whenever the weather allowed. The field was not going to be a showcase by spring planting. She'd stopped hoping for that. What it would be was workable, genuinely workable, for the first time since she'd arrived. And she'd take workable over anything she'd hoped for in October. Nolan himself had become something she didn't quite have a word for. Not hired help, though she was paying him something from the small amount she could manage. Not simply a neighbor's kid, though that was technically accurate. He was present in a way that had become structural. She'd notice his absence on the days he had obligations at his family's farm in a way that was slightly more than practical, and she'd made the decision to notice that she noticed it and then not do anything about it, because he was 16 going on 17 and she was 29, and there was no version of that she was willing to think about. What she could acknowledge was that he was steady, in the way that mattered most, not exciting, not dramatic, but consistently himself, showing up with his whole attention and leaving without requiring acknowledgement. She'd known very few people like that in her life, and she was careful not to take it for granted. March came in cold but clear, and with it came the final accounting. She sat at the kitchen table on the evening of March 28th with her notebook spread out, doing the numbers properly for the first time in weeks. Not the running calculation she did in her head each morning, but the full accounting, every line, every obligation, every incoming payment confirmed and recorded. The lamp made a small yellow circle on the table. Outside, the first sounds of actual spring were beginning to assert themselves. Water moving under the remaining snow, a bird she hadn't heard since October calling from somewhere in the creek brush. $60.75. She had $67.40. She wrote the number down and looked at it. $6.65 over what she owed. Not a cushion, exactly, but over. She had gone from $38 in December to over, and she had done it by selling warmth to people who needed it during the worst winter the county had seen in 2 decades. She allowed herself one moment, not celebration, because the farm wasn't secure yet, not by a long distance, but one moment of simply sitting with the number and what it had cost to get there. The cracked hands, the nights in the barn, the 4 days in the blizzard, the conversation with Crowder in the cold with her argument laid out like a hand of cards she'd had no choice but to play. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed, because April 1st was in 3 days and there was still work to do. She drove to Mill Haven on April 1st, not to Crowder's office. She didn't know where his office was, and she hadn't received any further communication from him since February. She went to the county recorder's office, because that was where the note was registered, and she presented herself at the counter at 9 in the morning with $61 in an envelope and the original terms of the note, and asked the clerk to process the payment in full with a receipt. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers who had the look of someone who processed payments all day and found most of them unremarkable, looked at the payment, looked at the note, and said, "This is held by Crowder Lending out of Mill Haven. I'll need to notify their office." "That's fine," she said. "I'll wait." She sat in the wooden chair by the counter for 40 minutes. The recorder's office smelled of paper and lamp oil and the particular dry mustiness of official documents stored in cool rooms. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and waited. When Crowder came, he came himself, rather than sending his assistant. She heard the outer door and looked up, and there he was, still in the good wool coat, the practiced smile already in position. He looked at her, and then at the payment the clerk had set on the counter, and she watched his eyes do the same rapid arithmetic she'd watched them do in the barn in February. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Mr. Crowder, you're prompt." "I said April 1st, she said. He picked up the payment envelope and looked inside it without removing the contents. Then he set it down and said something she hadn't expected. "The field," he said. "The East Field. The amendment system. Where did you learn that?" She looked at him. "From watching my aunt farm for 20 years and reading every agricultural pamphlet I could find in the county library. And the fiber, the rabbit fiber. Same aunt, different materials." He was quiet a moment. His smile had done the thing again, where it became slightly more genuine and therefore more readable, and what she read in it now was not satisfaction at a debt collected, but something closer to the expression of a man revising an opinion he'd held with some confidence. "I've foreclosed on 11 properties in this county in 4 years, he said. "Farmers who had more resources than you arrived with, and who had been on their land longer." "I know," she said. "Hester Calloway told me about the Denny place." "I wasn't apologizing for it," he said quickly. "It's a legal business." "I know that too." "I'm saying—" He stopped, reconsidered. "I'm saying that what you've done out there is unusual. It warranted more than my standard assessment." He looked at the payment again. Then he looked at her. "I have clients, people with money looking for frontier operations with growth potential. If you were ever considering outside capital—" "No," she said. It came out before he'd finished the sentence. She heard it herself and softened it slightly. "Not now, maybe not ever. I'll know if the time comes." He nodded once. That same single nod she'd gotten from him in the barn, the one that apparently meant point taken and filed. He signed the receipt the clerk put in front of him and pushed it across the counter to her. She folded the receipt and placed it carefully in her inside coat pocket, next to the spot where she'd been carrying a scrap of Angora fiber for 5 months. "Good luck with the spring planting," Crowder said. "Good luck with your next foreclosure," she said, and walked out. She stopped on the boardwalk outside the recorder's office and stood for a moment in the Millhaven air. Busier than Red Hollow, noisier. The street traffic of a larger town moving around her. The April sun was thin but present, the first real warmth she'd felt since October without a stove nearby to explain it. The receipt sat in her pocket. She thought about October, the wagon pulling into the Red Hollow farmyard, the gray-brown fields, the farmhouse smell that had taken 2 weeks to shift, the $240 that had felt like something when she'd left Ohio and had shrunk to almost nothing so fast. The mud lot where the trader's crates had sat, and she'd done arithmetic she shouldn't have been doing with money she couldn't afford to spend. 64 rabbits. She had 91 now, after the winter breeding cycle. Managed carefully, the numbers she'd chosen deliberately rather than let run out of control. 3 loom frames, one of which Ruth Tilson was operating with a competence that had outrun Alara's ability to teach her anything new. 6 women spinning on a rotating schedule. A field that wasn't what it needed to be yet, but was changed, visibly and measurably changed, from the dead ground she'd first walked in October. An order for 20 blankets and 30 pairs of gloves sitting on her kitchen table. She had not solved everything. The farm was solvent, but not secure. 1 bad season, 1 illness spreading through the herd, 1 lost order, and she'd be back at the edge of the thing she'd spent all winter keeping herself off. She knew this. She counted on knowing it, actually, because the people who forgot the edge were the ones who eventually went over it. But today in Millhaven, on April 1st, she was not at the edge. She pulled the receipt from her pocket and looked at it again. In the light, the clerk's handwriting confirming what she already knew. Then she folded it and put it back and walked to where she'd tied the horse and climbed up onto the wagon seat and turned toward home. The road back to Red Hollow ran through a stretch of open frontier that was showing the first green of the season. Not much, just the beginning suggestion of it. The ground still mostly brown, but with that underlying green that meant things were alive under there and working their way up. The sky above the frontier was the enormous particular blue of early spring, the kind of sky that doesn't look real to people from cities, because it isn't interrupted by anything. She drove through it and felt, for the first time since the day she'd arrived in Red Hollow and looked at 60 acres of dying ground, that the land under her was actually hers. Not legally. It had been legally hers since October, but hers in the way that mattered more than legal, earned and held and understood. She pressed the horse to a trot. There were rabbits to feed. Spring came to Red Hollow the way it always came to frontier country. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by 3 cold days, followed by rain that turned the roads to mud, followed by a morning so clear and still it felt like an apology for everything that had come before. The creek unfroze in stages, the ice going gray and granular before it broke up and moved, and the sound of running water came back to the eastern edge of Alara's property like something that had only been away for a season and had never really left. She planted the east field in the last week of April. She'd spent the 2 weeks prior preparing it, turning the soil, folding in the final accumulated amendment from the winter's rabbit production, working the ground until it had the texture she'd been working toward since October. It was not perfect. There were sections along the northern edge where the compaction went deeper than one season of amendment could fully address, and she marked those sections and left them fallow, which cost her about 8 acres of potential planting space, but saved her the waste of seed on ground that wasn't ready. What was ready? 42 usable acres. She planted in a rotation she'd been planning since January. Winter wheat for the primary cash crop, a section of turnips and parsnips in the southwest corner where the soil had responded best, and along the creek margin a strip of mixed cover crop that was less about this year's harvest and more about continuing to build what the ground needed. Nolan worked alongside her for the planting, as he had for most of the winter and early spring, and his father Joel came for 2 of the 4 days with a better plow than anything she owned and an eye for soil that had grown more attentive since she'd shown him the amendment results in February. Joel Breyer was a man whose opinions shifted slowly and entirely based on evidence, which she'd come to understand was not stubbornness, but a kind of integrity. He didn't change his mind easily, but when he changed it completely. On the second day of planting, Joel walked the length of the treated east field without speaking, the way he walked everything, his hands occasionally going down to pick up a handful of soil and crumble it. At the far end he turned and came back and said, "This was the Hargrove ground." Yes. Pete Hargrove said this field was finished, said it to me personally, maybe 3 years back. The soil wasn't finished, she said. It was depleted. That's different. He looked at her. What's the difference? Finished means dead. Depleted means empty. She gestured at the field. Empty things can be filled again. It just takes patience and the right material and the willingness to wait for a season that doesn't pay you back immediately. Joel was quiet for a moment, turning the soil in his hand. I've got a section on my North 40, he said. Been declining for 6 years. I put it in cover crop last year because I didn't know what else to do with it. Bring me a sample, she said. I'll tell you what I think. He looked at her with an expression that had no trace in it of the man who had thought she was doing foolish things with someone's livestock. I'll bring it tomorrow, he said. Ishem. The workshop, as everyone had started calling it, settled into its spring rhythm by May. The arrangement they'd worked out over the winter had solidified into something that had the feel of a real operation. Not formal, nothing written beyond the payment agreements she'd drafted in February, but structured in the way that things become structured when the people involved are practical and the work is real. Clara Breyer and Agnes Holt spun on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. Margaret Tilson came Tuesday and Thursday with her daughter Ruth, who had taken over the second loom entirely and was now producing blankets that were in some ways superior to Alara's own. Ruth had a feel for the diagonal twill that produced a slightly tighter weave, and she'd figured out on her own a variation that used a narrower weft thread to create a finer surface texture without reducing the insulation. Darcy Sims came when her husband's schedule at the smithy allowed, which was irregular but reliable in its way. Darcy was the fastest spinner of any of them, with the kind of muscle memory that made the wheel look effortless, and 2 days of her production was worth 3 of most others. The barn on a working morning had become a different place from the barn Alara had first lit a fire in back in October. The noise of it, wheels turning, the rhythmic thud of the loom beater, conversation running underneath everything like a current, had a quality she hadn't known she was missing until it arrived. She'd spent a long time being capable of working alone, had even preferred it, had told herself the silence was efficient. She understood now that efficiency and preference were not always the same thing, and that some kinds of work were better for having other people inside them. She didn't say this out loud. She wasn't that kind of woman, but she thought it. The Millhaven order moved forward steadily. By the end of May, they had completed 9 of the 20 blankets, and Briggs had come twice to collect finished batches, both times leaving with the expression of a man who was going to have good news to report. The gloves were running ahead of pace. With 4 women knitting in their evenings and Alara doing the finishing work, the 30-pair order was within reach by August rather than October, which gave them room to take additional orders from Harmon's growing list of interested buyers. Harmon had dropped his commission from 30% to 22% without being asked. She'd noticed it in the first March settlement and looked at him across the counter, and he'd looked back with the expression of a man who had done a calculation and arrived at a result and wasn't interested in discussing his methodology. She'd accepted it without comment because that was the language he spoke. The first real harvest came in July. She'd told herself not to expect much. One amended season wasn't enough to fully restore 60 years of depletion, and she'd planted at appropriate density for recovering soil rather than at maximum yield. She'd managed her expectations carefully, the way she managed most things, with a running internal accounting of best case and realistic case and the gap between them. The realistic case, it turned out, had been too conservative. The winter wheat came in at nearly twice what she'd projected. Not a record yield by any measure, nothing that would make a farmer in better soil country look twice. But for the Hargrove land, for ground that Pete Hargrove had called finished 3 years ago, it was the kind of number that made you stand at the edge of the field and do the math again because you didn't quite believe the first result. The turnips in the southwest corner were exceptional, fat and heavy, the soil there having responded to the amendment with what felt almost like eagerness, as if it had been waiting for someone to put something back into it instead of only taking. She stood at the edge of the east field on the first morning of harvest, in the early light before the heat of the day set in, and she looked at 60 acres of wheat that was golden and actual and hers, and she felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not triumph. Triumph was too loud for what she felt. It was quieter than that, more like the sensation of a long argument finally ending, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with the simple cessation of a tension that had been so constant you'd stop distinguishing it from the normal weight of being alive. Nolan was beside her. He'd developed the habit of showing up for the important mornings without being told they were important, which was either intuition or the fact that he paid close attention to the rhythm of the farm and could read it the way she could read soil. He looked at the field and then at her and didn't say anything for a while, which was right. Then he said, "You gonna tell me you knew this would happen?" "No," she said. "I knew it could. That's different." "Is it?" "Knowing something could happen and believing it will are 2 different kinds of faith," she said. "I try not to confuse them. The first one keeps you honest. The second one makes you careless." He was quiet for a moment. "My father says you should run a trial on the North 40 section he showed you." "I know. I'm going to." She paused. "I'm going to need him to agree to split the amendment supply. I can't produce enough from my herd alone to do both fields in the first season. He'll need to start his own rabbit operation if he wants to go at the same pace." "He'll agree to that." "How do you know?" Nolan smiled. The real one, not the polite one. "Because he's been reading every pamphlet in the county library since February," he said. "I found a stack of them in the kitchen. He thinks you don't know." She looked at him. "Tell him I know. Tell him yourself. He'd rather hear it from you." She looked back at the field. The morning light was coming in low and gold across the wheat tops, and somewhere in the creek brush, a bird was working through its limited repertoire with great confidence. It was the kind of morning that happened a few times a year on the frontier, when the light and the temperature and the smell of the air assembled themselves into something briefly perfect before the heat came up and the work resumed and the day became ordinary again. She let herself stand in it for 1 full minute. Then she picked up her work gloves and walked into the field. September brought the letter from a town called Garfield's Crossing, 40 miles west, which she read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and then sat down and picked up again and read a second time. A woman named Helen Marsh had written it. Alara didn't know her, had never been to Garfield's Crossing, Helen Marsh explained that she had purchased one of the Ashcombe blankets through the Mill Haven merchant in the spring, and that it had changed the quality of her household's winter in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't stop talking about, and that she had 3 neighbors who wanted to know if there was any possibility of ordering directly, and that she herself was curious whether the methods, the soil amendment, the rabbit fiber operation, could be replicated on a different piece of frontier land, and whether Miss Ashcombe had any interest in corresponding on the subject. Alara read the letter a 3rd time. Then she got out her writing paper and wrote back, because it seemed important not to leave the question unanswered. Over the following weeks, 2 more letters came from other towns. One from a farmer near Dunmore, who'd heard about the soil amendment work from Joel Breyer at a county meeting. One from a merchant in Caldwell who wanted to discuss a wholesale arrangement for gloves. She answered all of them. She was not a natural correspondent. She wrote the way she did most things, plainly and without decoration. But she answered all of them because they were real questions, and they deserved real answers. Hester watched this developing correspondence with an expression that combined satisfaction and something that might have been told you so, though Hester was too gracious to say it directly. "You're becoming known," she said one afternoon over coffee at the kitchen table. "I'm becoming useful," Alara said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Being known is about reputation. Being useful is about the work." She set down her cup. "I'll take useful." Hester smiled. "You can have both, you know." "I know." She looked out the kitchen window at the barn, at the hutch rows visible through the open door, at the east field behind it, brown now, and turned over for the winter, but carrying in its turned-over darkness the record of everything that had been put back into it. "I'm still getting used to the idea." The October Festival in Red Hollow was a tradition Alara had missed entirely the previous year. She'd arrived 2 weeks after it happened, to empty streets and the faint residue of celebration. This year she was present for the setup and the day itself, and the slow dispersal of the afternoon, and she found it both more and less than she'd expected. More because the community of it was real, not performed, not the kind of civic performance you went through out of obligation, but genuine in the way that frontier communities were genuine about their celebrations because they'd earned them with the rest of the year's difficulty. The harvest tables were full because most of the farms had done well, and the doing well was felt by everyone who remembered the winter's privations. Families who had huddled under Ashcombe blankets during the January blizzard ate their October meal with a specific awareness of where they'd been 9 months before, and that awareness changed the flavor of things. Less because she was still not entirely at ease with being part of a community in the unreserved way the celebration seemed to call for. She'd been alone for long enough that belonging felt like a coat that fit, but still felt new. Not wrong, just not yet fully worn in. She stood at the edge of the main table for a while, watching, before Hester came and stood beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Margaret Tilson found her near the end of the afternoon, when the tables were being cleared and the light was going orange and low. She had her daughter Ruth with her. Ruth, who was now producing blankets that people specifically asked for at Harmon's, the ones the young Tilson girl makes, with the fine surface, stood beside her mother with the slightly self-contained quality of a young person who has recently discovered they are good at something and is still figuring out what to do with that knowledge. "I want to ask you something," Margaret said. She had the tone of a woman who had rehearsed this and was going to say it anyway, despite the rehearsal. "Ruth is talking about whether she could make weaving her main work, not a supplemental thing. Her main work." She paused. "I wanted to ask what you thought." Alara looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at her steadily, no deflection in it. "I think she's talented enough that the question is serious," she said. "I think the demand is real enough that it's possible. Whether it's the right choice for her." She turned to Ruth directly. "What does it feel like when you're at the loom?" Ruth considered. "Like the only time I'm not thinking about anything else," she said. "Like the rest of it goes quiet." Alara nodded. "Then you already know the answer," she said. "The rest is just logistics." Ruth looked at her with an expression that was partly relief and partly something more complicated. The recognition of being seen accurately, which is a thing people need more than they usually admit to needing. "Thank you," she said. "Thank me by filling the November order," Alara said. "We're 4 blankets behind pace." Ruth laughed. "I'll be there Monday morning." The evening of the festival, Ulara walked the farm alone after dark, which was something she'd started doing in September when the evenings had gotten cool enough to make it pleasant rather than uncomfortable. She carried a lantern and walked the fence lines and the hutch rows and the turned-over east field, not for any practical reason, but because it was her habit, and because she found she needed it. The physical confirmation that the things she'd built were still there, still real, still intact. The rabbits were settled in their hay, 91 animals now, which was the number she'd decided on as the sustainable limit for her current capacity. She could go higher, and she'd thought about it, but she'd watched enough frontier farmers run themselves to ruin by expanding before their infrastructure was ready. The number she had was the number she could care for properly. When she was ready for more, she'd know. She stood at the end of the hutch row for a while with the lantern turned low, just listening. The animals moved occasionally, the soft shift of weight in hay, the particular murmur they made when something, her presence maybe, or a sound from outside, caused a brief collective awareness before they settled again. She'd spent so much time with these animals in the past year that she'd stopped consciously noticing them the way she had in the beginning, and she made herself notice them now, standing in the barn dark. $61 she'd spent, everything she had. She thought about the woman who had stood in that mud lot in November and looked at 6 crates of unwanted rabbits and done arithmetic that the arithmetic didn't support. She thought about what had driven that decision. Not confidence, exactly. She'd been far from confident. It had been something more like the recognition that the path she'd been on was ending, and this was a different path, and she had to choose between a certain slow failure and an uncertain possibility. That was all it had been. Not brilliance, not vision, just the refusal to accept an outcome because the numbers said it was coming. She thought about her mother's letters. 60 acres of open frontier, Alara. Room to grow. Her mother hadn't been wrong, exactly. She'd just had a different idea of what growing meant. The thing nobody told you about starting over was that it didn't feel like starting over from inside it. From inside it felt like continuation. Of every habit you'd built, every loss you carried, every piece of knowledge you'd accumulated in the years before, all of it brought along whether you wanted it or not. She hadn't started over in Red Hollow. She'd arrived as everything she already was and applied it to a new piece of ground. And the ground had answered. She thought about what she'd learned. Not the textile knowledge, not the soil science, not the breeding management or the workshop logistics. Those were real and useful, but they weren't what she meant. She meant something harder to put words to, something about the relationship between patience and action, the difference between waiting and preparing, the way a thing that looks like stubbornness from the outside can feel from the inside, like the only kind of faith that holds up when the numbers are against you. She thought about Edna Porter in the chair by the cold stove, gray-faced and shivering. She thought about the Henderson girl, 4 years old. She thought about Margaret Tilson and her 4 children in one warm room. She thought about the people who had laughed at the mudlot and then knocked on her barn door in February and offered their hands and their hours and their skills, not as apology exactly. Most of them hadn't said sorry, and she hadn't needed them to, but as the practical rerouting of opinion that happens when evidence accumulates to the point where it can't be argued with. People were not transformed by a blizzard. She'd been careful not to think of it that way, because that kind of thinking led to false conclusions. Walt Porter had not become a different man. He'd become a man who had new information and had adjusted his behavior accordingly. That was not transformation. That was just decency, operating on a longer lag than it should have, which was how decency usually operated. What she'd learned, and she turned this over now in the lantern-lit dark, slowly, the way you turn something over when you want to understand its actual shape, was that other people's opinions of what was possible had very little bearing on what was actually possible. The town of Red Hollow had looked at a woman alone on dead land with 60 rabbits and drawn a conclusion about her future. They hadn't been malicious. They'd been reasonable. The evidence available to them supported the conclusion they drew. They just didn't have access to her notebooks. Nobody ever did. Nobody could see what you were tracking, what you were building toward, what the numbers looked like in the accounting that ran inside your own head. The only person with full information was you, and even you didn't know how it was going to come out. You just knew the work you'd done and the choices you'd made and whether they were honest, whether they were the choices you'd make again if you had to. She would make them again, all of them, the $61. The 4 days in the blizzard, the argument in front of Crowder with her notebook laid out like evidence in a case she had to win. The morning she'd stood in the east field and done the math twice because she didn't believe the first result. She would make them all again. Utsk. Nolan found her there. Not unusual, he had a habit of materializing in the places where the work happened, some internal compass that oriented him toward useful presence. He came into the barn quietly, which was always how he came, and stood a few feet away with his hands in his coat pockets. "Festival's done," he said. "I know. Your friend Hester is looking for you. She has something she wants to give you. I'll go in a minute." She didn't move yet. He was quiet for a moment. In the year since she'd arrived, he'd grown, not just physically, though there was that, the last of the adolescent awkwardness resolving into something steadier, but in the less visible ways that happen to people who spent a year doing real work alongside someone they respected. He was not a kid anymore. She'd been aware of this for a while and had continued to not do anything about it, partly because the timing was wrong and partly because she was still figuring out her own arrangement with herself and taking on someone else's felt premature. But she was 30 now, in October, and he would be 17 in March, and the gap that had felt structural was not shrinking exactly, but becoming less of the point. She turned this thought over once and then set it down. Not yet. But the thought was there, and she'd acknowledged it, which was more than she'd allowed herself before. "What does Hester want to give me?" she asked. She wouldn't say. She just said to tell you she's been holding it since November and she's tired of holding it. Alara turned down the lantern and walked back to the house with him, through the October dark that smelled of turned earth and the last of the harvest, and the cold that was beginning to sharpen toward another winter. The farm was quiet and lit from inside, the kitchen window throwing yellow light across the frozen ground, and she could see Hester through the glass, seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the patience of a woman who had learned to wait for things without losing her place. The east field lay behind them in the dark. In the spring, it would produce again. Better than this year, she expected. The second season of amendment always stronger than the first. The hutch rows were quiet. Somewhere overhead, the sky was doing its October thing, the stars more defined as the warmth of the year receded and the air thinned, the whole apparatus of it visible and indifferent and enormous, in the way that frontier skies were enormous when there was nothing nearby to compete. She stopped for a moment at the porch step and looked up at it. Nolan stopped beside her without being asked to. She thought about the letters waiting on her kitchen table. Helen Marsh in Garfield's Crossing, the farmer near Dunmore, the merchant in Caldwell. She thought about Ruth Tilson at the loom, Ruth who was going to be better at it than she was, who was going to take what Alara had figured out and carry it somewhere Alara hadn't imagined yet. She thought about Clara Breyer's hands finding the spinning wheel again after years of absence. She thought about Joel Breyer crouching in the east field with a handful of amended soil, revising an opinion he'd held with great confidence. She thought about what a place was. Whether it was the ground under you, or the people around you, or the work you'd built into it, the accumulated decisions and their consequences, and the way all of it layered together over time into something that held your weight. She thought, this is it. This is the place. Not because it was where she'd come from, not because it was easy or beautiful or without its hard seasons, but because she had put herself into it, and it had answered, and because the people in it had changed along with her, and because she'd arrived here alone and would not leave that way. And because sometimes a home is not the place you were given, but the place you refuse to abandon when all the evidence said you should. Hester knocked on the glass from inside, impatient in her kind way. Alara smiled, not for anyone's benefit, just because it was there, and went inside. What Hester had been holding since November was small, a photograph taken the previous October by a traveling photographer who had come through Red Hollow before Alara arrived. It showed the town's main street in the early morning, empty, the storefronts dark, the road unpeopled. Hester had bought a copy for reasons she'd never fully explained and had meant to give it to Alara as a kind of document of what had been here when she arrived, before things changed. "It doesn't look like much," Hester said, handing it over. Alara looked at it, the empty street, the dark storefronts, the particular quality of a place before it knows what it's going to become. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Hester, who was watching her with the expression she used when she cared about something and was trying not to show how much. "Thank you," Elara said, "for all of it, not just the photograph." Hester waved her hand in the manner of someone dismissing sentiment before it could fully land. "Don't thank me. You did the work. You stayed beside it." "That's different." "It isn't," Elara said. "That's the part people don't talk about, the ones who stayed beside it." Hester was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to be all right through this next winter?" Elara thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, looking at the real numbers, the actual conditions, the gap between where she was and where she needed to be. The payment was cleared. The orders were running ahead of pace. The field was ready for spring. The herd was healthy. The workshop had 5 women who came without being asked and worked with their full attention and had started to feel, in the way that real things feel, like something that would outlast its original necessity. "Yes," she said. "I think so. You don't sound entirely sure." "I'm not entirely sure," she said, "but I've got more to work with than I did last year." She picked up her coffee cup. "That's usually enough." Outside, the October sky held its enormous indifferent stars. The rabbits were warm in the barn. The east field lay ready under its beginning of frost, carrying everything that had been put back into it, patient in the way that good ground is patient. Not passive, not resigned, but holding its capability in reserve, waiting for the right season and the right hands, and the long, slow work of being restored to what it had always been capable of becoming. That was the thing about depleted things. The potential was still there. It had never left. It was just waiting for someone willing to stay long enough to find it. Elara Ashcombe had stayed, and the ground, in its own time, had answered.